April 2021. A quiet farm in rural Michigan. The kind of place where neighbors are miles apart and secrets can stay buried for a very long time. 52-year-old Dee Ann Warner disappeared overnight. No phone calls, no bank activity, no social media, nothing. Her children said something was wrong immediately. Dee would never just leave. But her husband, Dale Warner, had a different explanation. He told investigators that Dee might have simply taken off. Maybe she needed space. Maybe she ran away. But the people who knew Dee best didn't believe that for a second. Because behind the scenes, their marriage was falling apart. Text messages revealed Dee had reached her breaking point. She was planning to leave. Divorce, sell the family businesses, start over. But Dee Warner never got the chance. For 3 years, her family searched for answers. Investigators searched the land, and rumors spread throughout Lenawee County. Something terrible had happened on that farm. Then in 2024, police made a discovery that shocked even seasoned detectives. Hidden on the Warner property, inside a sealed fertilizer tank, they found Dee. Her body had been hidden there for years. The quiet farmland that once hid the truth was now the center of a murder investigation. And the man who claimed he had nothing to do with her disappearance was suddenly the prime suspect. This is the story of control, a marriage unraveling, and a crime investigators say was hidden in plain sight. Because sometimes the most terrifying secrets aren't the ones buried deep in the woods. They're the ones buried in your own backyard. This is Unsaid Case Files, and tonight we examine the murder of Dee Warner. On the night of April 24th, 2021, something changed on a quiet farm in Michigan. By the next morning, Dee Ann Warner was gone. Dee was a mother, a businesswoman, and a central figure in a large blended family. She shared multiple businesses and thousands of acres of farmland with her husband, Dale Warner. To outsiders, their life appeared stable, successful even. But behind closed doors, the reality was far more complicated. Friends and family would later describe their marriage as deeply troubled. Arguments were frequent. Trust had eroded. And according to people close to Dee, she had finally decided she'd had enough. In the days leading up to her disappearance, Dee sent messages that painted a clear picture of her mindset. She wanted out. She told Dale their relationship had become unbearable. She said they were living like strangers in the same house, and she planned to leave. Not just leave the marriage, but sell their businesses and start over. Then suddenly, she vanished. When family members realized no one had heard from Dee, alarm bells began ringing immediately. Her phone went silent. Her bank accounts were untouched. Her social media stopped. There was no activity anywhere. For investigators, that was a major red flag. Adults sometimes leave voluntarily, but they don't usually abandon their finances, their family, and their entire life without a trace. Dee's children and relatives reported her missing soon after. Authorities began searching the rural property near Tipton, a small farming community in Lenawee County. The property was massive. Fields, buildings, equipment, storage tanks. Plenty of places where something, or someone, could disappear. When investigators first spoke with Dale Warner, he suggested several possibilities. Maybe Dee had left to clear her head. Maybe she had run away. Maybe something else had happened. But the longer the investigation continued, the harder those explanations became to believe. Because Dee Warner didn't just leave her life behind. She vanished from it completely. And for the next 3 years, no one knew where she was, or what had really happened on that farm. When Dee Ann Warner disappeared, investigators initially treated the case as a missing person investigation. But almost immediately, things didn't add up. Detectives began examining Dee's digital footprint, her phone records, bank activity, and online accounts. What they found was chilling. There was nothing. No calls, no purchases, no messages. It was as if Dee had simply vanished from the world overnight. That kind of total silence rarely happens voluntarily. Meanwhile, attention slowly began turning toward the person who had last seen her alive. Her husband, Dale Warner. Family members described the relationship as toxic and controlling. Some said Dale tracked Dee's movements. Others said the arguments between them had grown more intense in the months before she vanished. Still, proving a crime had occurred was another matter. The Warner property near Tipton stretched across thousands of acres of farmland. Investigators searched fields, barns, and equipment. Drones flew overhead. Canine units combed the property. But despite multiple searches, there was no sign of Dee. No body. No crime scene. And without that, the case risked going cold. But Dee's family refused to let that happen. They launched a campaign called Justice for Dee, determined to keep her story in the public eye. Because they believed one thing with absolute certainty. Dee Warner didn't just disappear. Someone made her disappear. And eventually, investigators would uncover a discovery hidden in plain sight. One that would change the entire investigation. For nearly 2 years, the disappearance of Dee Ann Warner remained a mystery. Investigators had suspicions. Family members had fears. But without physical evidence, there was little they could prove. Then, in 2023, the investigation took a major turn. The Michigan State Police officially took over the case from local authorities, bringing new investigators and fresh resources to the search. Detectives began reviewing everything again. Phone records, witness statements, surveillance footage, even small details that might have been overlooked years earlier. Slowly, a timeline began to form. It pointed investigators back to the same place they had searched before, the Warner family property. The land stretched across thousands of acres, filled with barns, machinery, and storage tanks used for farming operations. To investigators, it was both a crime scene and a maze. But they believed the truth was still there. Then, in November 2023, authorities made a major announcement. After years of investigation, police arrested Dale Warner and charged him with murder and tampering with evidence. At the time of the arrest, Dee's body had still not been found. Prosecutors were preparing to pursue what's known as a no-body homicide case. These cases are extremely difficult to prove in court, but investigators said the evidence they had gathered painted a clear picture. They believed Dee had been killed on the property the night she disappeared. Still, one critical question remained unanswered. Where was Dee? Then, in August 2024, investigators returned once again to the Warner property with a search warrant. This time, they focused on a large agricultural tank sitting on the land. From the outside, it looked ordinary, just another piece of farm equipment. But when detectives examined the tank closely, they noticed something unusual. The tank had been resealed, welded shut. When investigators finally opened it, they made the discovery Dee's family had both feared and hoped for. Inside the tank, they found the remains of Dee Warner. After more than 3 years, the mystery of her disappearance was finally solved. But the discovery raised an even darker question. If Dee had been hidden there the entire time, who put her there? And how long had the truth been sitting in plain sight? When investigators recovered the remains of Dee Ann Warner from the tank on the Warner property, the case changed overnight. What had once been a missing person investigation was now a confirmed homicide. A medical examiner performed an autopsy to determine exactly what happened to Dee. The findings were disturbing. According to forensic reports, Dee had died from strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head and face. Investigators believed the attack happened the night she disappeared in April of 2021. Prosecutors argued that a confrontation had taken place between Dee and her husband, Dale Warner. In the days leading up to her disappearance, Dee had made it clear she was leaving the marriage. She planned to divorce Dale. She wanted to sell their shared businesses, and she intended to start a new life away from the farm. Prosecutors said that decision may have triggered a violent confrontation. After Dee was killed, investigators believe her body was temporarily hidden inside a safe. Then, using farming equipment, her body was transported across the property. Finally, prosecutors say, the body was placed inside an agricultural fertilizer tank. The tank was then resealed and welded shut. From the outside, it appeared to be nothing more than a piece of farm equipment sitting quietly on the property. But inside, it concealed the truth about what had happened to Dee Warner. And for more than 3 years, that secret remained hidden on the very land where she had last been seen alive. The murder trial of Dale Warner began in February 2026, inside the courthouse in Lenawee County. For the first time in nearly 5 years, the story of what happened to Dee Ann Warner would be laid out in front of a jury. Prosecutors argued that Dee's disappearance was never a mystery. They believed it was a calculated attempt to hide a murder. According to their case, Dee had reached a breaking point in her marriage. Messages and testimony showed she was preparing to divorce Dale and sell the businesses they owned together. Prosecutors said that decision threatened everything Dale stood to lose: his marriage, his reputation, and control over their massive farming operation. They argued that during a confrontation on the night of April 24th, 2021, Dee was killed. From there, prosecutors laid out what they believed happened next. They told jurors that Dale hid Dee's body, transported it using farm machinery, and eventually sealed her remains inside a fertilizer tank on the property. But the defense told a very different story. Attorneys argued that the prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. They insisted there was no direct eyewitness and no definitive proof that Dale had committed the crime. Instead, they suggested investigators built a theory and then tried to make the evidence fit it. During the trial, jurors heard testimony from family members, investigators, employees, and forensic experts. One of the most emotional moments came when Dee's brother testified about the years his family spent searching for answers. The jury also heard recorded jail phone calls and saw forensic evidence connected to the tank where Dee's remains were found. For weeks, the courtroom was filled with testimony that painted a picture of a marriage filled with tension, control, and growing conflict. Then, after days of arguments from both sides, the fate of Dale Warner would rest with 12 jurors. As the trial continued, prosecutors began presenting the evidence they believed tied Dale Warner directly to the death of Dee Ann Warner. Some of it came from forensic analysis, some came from digital records, and some came from the property itself. One of the most critical pieces of evidence centered around the tank where Dee's remains were discovered. Investigators testified that the agricultural tank had been resealed and welded shut. To prosecutors, that wasn't normal maintenance. They argued it was an attempt to permanently conceal what was inside. Forensic investigators examined the tank carefully. Fingerprints were analyzed. Investigators also examined the tools and machinery that could have been used to move the tank or transport Dee's body. But the case wasn't built on physical evidence alone. Jurors were also shown phone records and vehicle data that helped investigators reconstruct the timeline surrounding Dee's disappearance. Experts explained how modern vehicles store data about movements and activity, information that can sometimes reveal when and where a vehicle traveled. Combined with phone records, investigators were able to piece together what they believed were the final hours of Dee's life. Then there were the jail phone calls. While awaiting trial, Dale made several recorded calls from jail, calls prosecutors played for the jury. Every jail call is recorded, and prosecutors believed some of the statements made during those conversations were revealing. Detectives also testified about the long investigation that led them back to the Warner property again and again. For years, the truth had remained hidden there, buried among equipment, buildings, and farmland. But prosecutors argued that once investigators followed the evidence step by step, the path always led back to one person, Dale Warner. And by the time the prosecution rested its case, they believed the evidence told a clear story, a story of murder, and of a secret hidden in plain sight for more than 3 years. As prosecutors laid out their case, the defense team for Dale Warner worked to create one thing in the minds of the jury: reasonable doubt. Defense attorneys argued that the prosecution's case relied almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. There were no eyewitnesses to the alleged murder, no direct video of the crime, And according to the defense, no single piece of evidence that definitively proved Dale Warner had killed his wife, Dee Ann Warner. They suggested investigators had become convinced of Dale's guilt early in the investigation. From that point forward, they argued, every piece of evidence was interpreted through that assumption. The defense also pointed out the long timeline in the case. Dee disappeared in April of 2021. Her remains were not discovered until August of 2024. That 3-year gap, they argued, left many unanswered questions. During the trial, the defense attempted to challenge the reliability of certain forensic findings and investigative conclusions. They emphasized that suspicion, even strong suspicion, is not the same as proof. In a criminal trial, the burden is entirely on the prosecution. And according to the defense, the prosecution had built a theory, but had not proven it beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, after weeks of testimony and evidence, the case was about to enter its final stage. Closing arguments would soon begin, and the decision about Dale Warner's fate would soon rest with 12 jurors inside a courtroom in Lenawee County. After weeks of testimony, forensic evidence, and emotional statements from family members, the trial of Dale Warner reached its final stage. Closing arguments. This was the moment both sides would try to bring everything together for the jury. Prosecutors stood before the courtroom and laid out the story they believed the evidence clearly supported. They argued that the disappearance of Dee Ann Warner was never a mystery. It was murder. They reminded jurors about the timeline leading up to Dee's disappearance. The text messages where she said she wanted a divorce. Her plans to sell the family businesses and leave the marriage. According to prosecutors, that confrontation changed everything. They argued that Dale Warner had both the motive and the opportunity to commit the crime. And they pointed jurors back to the discovery that had shocked investigators. Dee's remains hidden inside a fertilizer tank on the Warner property. Prosecutors told the jury that the tank had been resealed and welded shut, something they argued could only have been done by someone with access to the property and equipment. To them, the evidence formed a clear chain of events: a confrontation, a murder, and a carefully hidden body. But the defense urged jurors to see the case very differently. They reminded the jury that criminal convictions require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They argued that while Dee's death was tragic, the prosecution had not presented direct evidence proving Dale committed the crime. No witnesses saw the murder. No video showed it happening. And according to the defense, the prosecution's case depended on assumptions rather than certainty. In the end, the defense told the jury that suspicion alone cannot justify a conviction. Now the case was in the hands of 12 jurors. They would examine the evidence, discuss the testimony, and decide whether the prosecution had truly proven its case. The fate of Dale Warner and the search for justice for Dee Warner now rested entirely with them. After closing arguments ended, the jury in the trial of Dale Warner left the courtroom to begin deliberations. For weeks, they had listened to testimony about the disappearance and death of Dee Ann Warner. Now they had to answer the question at the center of the entire case: was Dale Warner responsible for her death? Deliberations began late in the week inside the courthouse in Lenawee County. Jurors carefully reviewed the evidence, the forensic findings, the witness testimony, The timeline prosecutors said showed what happened on the night Dee disappeared. But the process wasn't completely smooth. At one point, deliberations were paused when a juror experienced a personal emergency. The trial was temporarily delayed while the situation was resolved. Then the jury returned and continued their discussions. Finally, on March 10th, 2026, the jury reached a decision. Inside the courtroom, family members, attorneys, and reporters waited as the verdict was read. The jury found Dale Warner guilty of second-degree murder. They also found him guilty of tampering with evidence. After nearly 5 years of questions, investigations, and court proceedings, a jury had determined that Dee Warner had been murdered and that her husband was responsible. For Dee's family, the verdict brought an emotional moment of relief. But even with the conviction, the story of Dee Warner would leave behind a haunting reminder. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden far away. Sometimes it's been sitting in plain sight the entire time. When the guilty verdict was read, the courtroom fell silent. Then emotions took over. Family members of Dee Ann Warner cried, hugged one another, and finally felt a moment of relief after years of uncertainty. For nearly 5 years, they had searched for answers. They had pushed investigators to keep the case alive. They had organized rallies and campaigns demanding justice. And now, a jury had delivered that justice. The man once at the center of Dee's life, her husband, Dale Warner, had been found guilty of killing her. He now faces the possibility of life in prison when he is sentenced in Lenawee County. But even with the verdict, the case leaves behind painful questions about the years leading up to Dee's death and the warning signs that may have been missed. For Dee's loved ones, the verdict doesn't erase the loss, but it does bring something they fought years to achieve: accountability, and the chance for Dee Warner's story to finally be heard. The murder of Dee Ann Warner is a reminder that some of the darkest crimes don't happen in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes they happen in places that are supposed to feel the safest: homes, families, communities. For years, Dee's disappearance left more questions than answers. But the determination of her family, investigators, and the justice system eventually brought the truth to light. And while a verdict has now been reached for Dale Warner, the impact of Dee's story will continue to be felt by those who loved her. Cases like this remind us why these stories matter, because every victim deserves to be remembered, and every story deserves to be told. Thank you for listening to Unsaid Case Files. If you want to support the show, make sure to follow and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you found this episode compelling, please consider leaving a review and sharing it with someone who enjoys true crime stories. Until next time, stay curious, stay aware, because sometimes the most chilling stories are the ones that were hidden in plain sight.